Fort Wadsworth is a recreational area that used to be an active military installation in Staten Island, New York. Not only did it play a role in American conflicts like the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812, but it was also the stage for Lighthouse drama. I'm Carolina, and welcome to the Lighthouse Narrative. We're going to check out lighthouses built on military sites in New York Harbor and deep dive into the history of Fort Wadsworth Light. In the upper New York Bay is Governor's Island, a recreational park just south of Manhattan. On its northwestern side is a circular sandstone fort known as Castle Williams. It was erected between 1807 and 1811, designed to protect New York Harbor from invasion, along with its neighboring forts. Its use has been repurposed over the years, from being a barracks to then a prison. Currently, it's a historical landmark. One of the earliest navigational aids installed on the island was from 1873, a fog signal house built at the seawall of Castle Williams. On top of the house was a fog bell, which was struck manually when fog limited visibility, so ships could avoid crashing into the island upon hearing it. This bell was replaced by a compressed air siren in 1901 that operated on an oil engine. The house itself had to be carefully maintained by a keeper, as bits of it blew off when the guns fired from the fort. Around 1888, a post light was placed on top of Castle Williams, right above the fog signal house. It was equipped with 2 red lights. While the light was a skeletal tower rather than the traditional lighthouses we've come to know and love, it was still an active aid to navigation. In 1910, an additional light and fog signal were requested to mark the southwestern end of Governor's Island, hence the establishment of Governor's Island Light Station. Keepers of this station not only managed the skeletal lighthouse, but also the post light at Castle Williams and a series of bells installed on the eastern side of the island that helped mariners navigate the Buttermilk Channel. The only one of these structures to survive till present day is the post light on top of Castle Williams, serving as a reminder that a lighthouse once existed there. I do have a personal story I want to slide on in here. I've been to Governor's Island a couple of times since I live in New York City. In 2016, I took my Polaroid camera to the island. On its southwestern end, I noticed this skeletal tower completely rusting to filth. I know rust isn't great for structures to have, but I can't help thinking they add some extra character to them. So I took a photo of the tower and continued on my way. When I was doing research for this topic, I decided to look through all of my photos of the island, including the Polaroids. And wouldn't you know, I took a photo of Governor's Island Light without realizing what it was before it was demolished in 2018. The Narrows is a tidal strait connecting the lower New York Bay to the upper New York Bay, both of which make the whole of New York Harbor. To defend this location in the 1800s, Fort Hamilton was built in Brooklyn on one side of the Narrows, while Fort Wadsworth was built in Staten Island on the other. I imagine you're probably thinking, yes, we're going to talk about Fort Wadsworth Light. But no, you're wrong. Let me explain. Fort Wadsworth wasn't Fort Hamilton's only neighbor. A few miles offshore from the Brooklyn fort was a small island known as Hendricks Reef. To further beef up security on the Narrows, Hendricks Reef was chosen as the location for Fort Diamond. This fort was built from 1812 to 1818. It was renamed Fort Lafayette in 1824. Fort Lafayette didn't see any military action since the War of 1812 with the British had ended, but it was used as a prison during the Civil War. Fort Lafayette's fog signal was established around 1874. It's not clear when the lighthouse was built, possibly in the late 1920s to the early 1930s, as photos of the fog signal in 1921 don't show the lighthouse. Regardless, the The station's setup was similar to Castle Williams, where the fog signal house was placed along the seawall of the fort. The lighthouse was a tall skeletal tower, standing some feet away from the fog signal. After World War II, the fort and the lighthouse were left abandoned. With the planned construction of what we know as the Verrazano Narrows Bridge, it was decided to use the fort as part of the project. In 1960, Fort Lafayette and the lighthouse were torn down. Its foundation was used as a base for the Brooklyn Tower of the bridge. Across from Fort Hamilton, on the northeastern shore of Staten Island, is Fort Wadsworth, a former military installation that now serves as a recreational area. The area used to be known as Fort Richmond until 1865, when the name was changed. During its active years, Fort Wadsworth was home to several fortifications, including Fort Richmond, now known as Battery Weed, Batteries Caitlin, Duane, Hudson, and Fort Tompkins. Fort Tompkins was built in 1807 on a hill overlooking the Narrows. It received two companions in 1828, a keeper's dwelling and a 40-foot conical tower known as Fort Tompkins Light, which guided mariners in and out of the harbor. Unfortunately, the tower was built too close to the fort, so during training, the artillery firings broke the lighthouse's lantern room glass. The entire station had to be relocated, but that would cost a hefty sum, so a more cost-effective solution was implemented. The lighthouse and keeper's dwelling were dismantled, and for $8,000, a new lighthouse, inspired by Victorian architecture with gingerbread trim, was constructed. It went into service on December 20th, 1873. Fort Tompkins Light served over 20 years before it was deemed an ineffective navigational aid. Building it further inland made the light less visible, so a new site had to be found once again. Battery Weed was the prime option, as it was located directly on the waterfront. But the lighthouse remained unmoving, even when a battery of 5 high-powered rifles were installed behind it as part of the fort in 1895. Despite this, the relocation was still delayed due to a lack of funds. In the meantime, the Lighthouse Board installed a fog bell at the seawall of Battery Weed to serve as an audible aid to navigation. It wasn't until 1901 that Congress finally provided $12,900 for the project, which included constructing a new lighthouse and fog signal while converting Fort Tompkins Light into a keeper's dwelling. The project commenced in 1902, and during construction, misfortune struck. Alfred L. Carlo was the first principal lighthouse keeper of Old Orchid Shoal Light, located in the lower New York Bay. At a salary of $600, he served from 1883 to 1902 before being admitted to the U.S. Marine Hospital in New York for nervous exhaustion. Unlike Fort Tompkins, Old Orchid Shoal Light was isolated from human contact, and over the years, Alfred's mental health deteriorated from loneliness. He retired from the lighthouse service after his stint in the hospital, but he wasn't quite done with lighthouses yet. His daughter, Annie, was the wife of William B. Davis, the keeper of Fort Tompkins Light at the time. On October 17, 1902, Alfred joined Annie and William for dinner at the lighthouse. Afterward, he made his way to the lantern room, tied a rope to one of the rafters, and hung himself in front of the light. Annie was the one to discover his body. The damage to his mental health was too much for Alfred to manage. Despite the tragedy, construction continued on, and in 1903, the fog bell at the seawall was removed, and a new fog signal and lighthouse were built on top of Battery Weed, formerly named Fort Wadsworth Light. It went into operation the same day Fort Tompkins Light was decommissioned, May 11th that same year. Another year passed before Fort Tompkins Light was successfully relocated and renovated into a new keeper's dwelling for the Fort Wadsworth keepers. The project was finally completed and the lighthouse's relocation issues resolved. Everything would be well at the lighthouse, right? On the morning of May 27, 1909, Principal Keeper Nielsen L. Ackerman was on duty when an unexpected surprise met him at the lighthouse. When he stepped outside, he discovered the German steamship Princess Alice had run aground below the fog signal, the bow of the ship just reaching the front door to the lighthouse. The area was thick with fog, so the sound of the fog bell supposedly masked the noise of the crash. On spotting one of the crewmen, Nielsen greeted, "Hello, when did you get here?" The crewman replied, "Just arrived." Fortunately, no one was injured and the steamship was refloated. As comical as this scene must have been, the next, not so much. In 1941, Keeper Hans T. A. Booth was transferred to Fort Wadsworth Light, having just completed over 20 years of service at Bergen Point Light in New Jersey. In 1942, he fell down the stairs and was severely injured. He was forced to retire and recuperate, but it wasn't enough for a full recovery, as he passed away from his injuries on June 3rd at the age of 67. The events at Fort Tompkins and Fort Wadsworth Lights showed the many facets lighthouse life could take on. Even when civilian keepers were replaced by Coast Guard personnel in the 1950s, this sentiment would still prove true. Boatswain Mate First Class Jacob A. Hughes and Engineman First Class Thomas E. Sumogi served as Coast Guard keepers of Fort Wadsworth Light in 1958. Jacob, his wife Marion, and their 1-year-old daughter lived with Thomas, his wife Bridget, their daughter, and 2 stepsons in the former Fort Tompkins Light. Despite what pictures may show you, the residence was not spacious for 2 families, so privacy was always an issue. On top of that, Jacob and Thomas didn't get along, so they only communicated on work-related topics. The perks of living on a military base, including access to the movies and the NCO Club, also known as the Non-Commissioned Officers Club, didn't diffuse the tension between the 2 men. It actually amplified it, as they both isolated themselves from engaging with Army personnel. Isolation, boredom, and the sharing of tight quarters made their relationship frostier than ever. Luckily, their wives didn't hold animosity towards each other and actually got along fairly well, attending events at the club together. One evening in November of 1958, this would change. Thomas, who apparently had too much to drink, went to pick up his wife Bridget and Marion at the club. Marion told Thomas to relay a message to her husband. She was heading to a girlfriend's house first and would be home later. When the Sumugi couple arrived home, Thomas went to Jacob's side of the house to supposedly relay this message, but in his drunken state, communication broke down. What first started off as a tense exchange of words devolved into an argument when Thomas made an unfavorable remark about Marion, although we don't know exactly what he said. A physical altercation ensued, and then they retreated to arm themselves. Jacob brandished a kitchen knife, while Thomas grabbed a claw hammer, the fight spilling over into the hallway. All the while, Mrs. Dalberg, Jacob's mother, was listening from the apartment, having come to visit her son. When she rushed over to the hall, she saw Thomas covered in blood, a knife embedded in his neck, his carotid artery splayed open. Jacob was able to get a doctor to the house, and Thomas was rushed to the U.S. Public Service Hospital in New Jersey, but he passed away the next morning. He was only 28 years old. On the charge of murder at 30 years old, Jacob was sent to the Army stockade on Governor's Island and was later tried in federal court. In 1959, he was acquitted on the claim of self-defense. When Bridget, now Thomas's widow, heard the verdict, she shouted, "God would take care of you." Newspapers speculated that a love triangle had caused the incident, but Marion denied such claims, declaring Thomas's death a terrible accident. During this tumultuous period at the lighthouse, plans for the Verrazano Narrows Bridge were underway. Construction started in 1959, and the bridge opened in 1964. Due to the new structure's bright lights, Fort Wadsworth Light was decommissioned in 1965. The lighthouse changed ownership several times throughout the years and eventually fell into disrepair, the floorboards rotting and the lantern room rusting. Vandals, a constant plague to lighthouses everywhere, broke in and destroyed the windows. At some point, even the Fort Tompkins residence was destroyed. Fort Wadsworth Light eventually came under the ownership of the National Park Service in 1995, but it was a lighthouse enthusiast who became a beacon of hope to the neglected tower. Joseph N. Esposito was a lighthouse historian and a preservationist who lived on Staten Island. He was the caretaker of Staten Island Rear Range Light from 1982 to 2001, having stepped down due to medical issues. He also enjoyed creating lighthouse models, of which he donated some to the National Lighthouse Museum. In 2002, Joseph fell in love with Fort Wadsworth Light and launched a restoration plan to save it. When the plan was approved by the Park Service, Joseph and his crew of volunteers worked for years to restore it to its former glory. Joseph's work was a success, but he would not live to see it reactivated. Joseph passed away a few months before the relighting ceremony, which took place on September 24, 2005. Anna Esposito, his widow, accepted a plaque of appreciation on his behalf. She was given the honor of reactivating the lighthouse not only for her husband, but also for a light that deserved to shine once again. Thank you for listening to the histories of these lighthouses. Join me next time as we continue to explore lighthouse history and the story of its keepers. Until then, happy lighthouse hunting.